Hi, I'm Ryan, and in this video, we're just going to work through some of the grouping features in Pro Tools. We're going to go through grouping tracks, grouping clips, things that we can do in the groups list, some preferences that are involved. We'll also talk about VCAs and the differences between the edit and mix window when you're working with these features. So in my opinion, there's just a huge difference between working through a project, utilizing all of these details and not. And even in projects where I decide to work through and get to a certain point and I don't want to stop and organize along the way, I always get to a place where I know that in order to get the balance of the mix right, I need to backtrack and reintroduce these things into the project for that to work out the way that I want it to, for things to sound the way that I need to, and to have control over those elements. So definitely want to take advantage of these organizational features, and that's what we're going to get into here. We thank the creator for our time today. Let's get into it. Okay, so what I have here is a Pro Tools session with a number of sections of tracks that I took out of a project I'm working on. Obvious options in here for us to do some group settings. I have a whole bunch of groups actually already created, so I'm not trying to work through an entire session here. I just want to use this as a demonstration to show you how a number of these features can work for you, okay? At the left over here, we have a tracks and groups list showing. Just so you understand that, you can go to the View menu, and that's under Other Displays, and you have Track List right there, and also the Group List is part of that underneath. There are not normally quick keys assigned to this, and so you can see I've assigned a couple quick keys to my views in Pro Tools for the track list and the clip list. And so I also have a video that I've created to talk about how I work through quick keys. I use the Start key a lot, and I'll explain all of that in there, so I'll just keep moving with this discussion. A lot of quick keys in Pro Tools, but even with groups, there are a lot of specific details in here, so I'll probably use a couple keys from time to time here. Okay, so under our groups list, you can see we have a whole bunch of groups created already. We'll go ahead and work through the process of creating a group fresh and talk about what's all involved with that. So I'm just going to take my first 3 tracks here. These are violin tracks, violin layers, for example. And I don't have a group created for these. You can see I have a strings group that's a little bit bigger. But for these tracks, we're going to create a new group, okay? So Control-G on Windows or Command-G on a Mac opens the Create Group dialog box. Now, the thing about creating a new group in Pro Tools, and by default, this happens a lot, which is that this Follow Globals box is checked. And we're going to talk through that and how kind of dangerous that can be if you get in the habit of doing Follow Globals with everything. And so I'll explain that in just a moment, but this whole window is grayed out because Follow Globals is checked in this example. And so the first thing we're going to do is give our group a name, and we're going to call this just violins, okay? Next to the violins, you have an ID letter. The ID letter is used from you pushing that key on the keyboard for turning that group on or off. That's called group list focus, okay? Your A to Z keys are mapped to turning groups on or off. We call that enabling or disabling. And so I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to see what keys are available, what letters are available to me. And V is available to go with my violins, so that's something that'll be easier to remember. So I'm going to use V, and then I can get into what I actually want to be linked in this group. So let me explain what Follow Globals means. Follow Globals means you are going to specifically only use the Globals tab. The Globals tab over here is an ongoing setting that is controlling every group in your session automatically that is checked to follow globals. So what that means is right now I'm only using the violins group, right? So if I keep the violins group here and I say, well, I only want to do volume linking for this, and I click OK. Well, what I just did is if there is any other group in the session that was checked to follow globals, then that all of those groups just switch to only linking faders. And maybe I want that to happen. Maybe not. Probably not. You probably don't want to arbitrarily change a setting that applies to the entire session if all of your groups are following that. I don't use follow groups a whole lot, but I'll just explain to you the advantages of it as well, right? Let's say that you're doing a major music project, and for the most part, all of your instrument groups only link volume, mute, and solo. Whereas when you get to your vocal tracks, you start to do a lot of specific things with linking vocals in a session. So maybe all of your instrument groups could be set to follow globals, and maybe you update that with a setting here or there on the fly for how you want the character of the session to change with what you want control over. But in that example, anything that you do in this tab in any of the groups, right? So if I go into the kicks group, you're still in the globals tab that's applying for everything. And you just want to be aware of that. But there are scenarios where that could be useful if you tend to do the same thing over and over and over. If you do a lot of effects layering for post-production, I can imagine that you would have a lot of groups that would just be set up with the same kind of linking. And you're linking layers here and linking layers here for, for this scene, for that scene, but your workflow is the same and how you go about it, then that would be valuable to you. I am very careful about what's linked from group to group because, as you can see, we can link things like inserts and sends, and we can be really particular about those kinds of things in here. So I'm going to uncheck follow globals, and that means that whatever happens in this tab has no effect on this group at all. So that's a little bit, could be a little bit confusing as well. Just unchecking that box doesn't mean you're in the clear. If you go in here and you change this, right, then you're actually changing what the global settings are, even though that's not applying to the group that you're actually showing. So for the violins group specifically, you have to make sure that you're in the attributes tab. And these are the attributes for this group specifically, okay? So volume, mute, and solo is pretty obvious. I'm going to also do an insert A control linking, and I'll do a send level control linking as well, just for demonstration purposes, okay? And here's my thought process behind this. I'm linking 3 violin layer tracks, so it's very likely I'm going to EQ them similarly, or EQ them kind of together. And they are not routed through an aux track or an instrument track, if you've seen some of the other stuff I've done. They are part of a larger string group that's going to a subgroup down here. So we can see how they're kind of laid out with a subgroup for all of the strings. So that means there isn't a place for me to insert just one EQ for all of the violins. And in this example, I'm going to link the inserts for A for the violin tracks. Now this only works if you use the same plugin on insert A for all 3 tracks. It doesn't arbitrarily understand how to link a Melda EQ and an Avid EQ. So if they're different EQs, it's not going to work anyway. So there's a number of ways to get around this. And I guess what I'm starting with is to show you one of the best things you can do is give yourself options when you create groups. I could link insert A, and my idea is to link all 3 EQs. But if my idea when I'm mixing changes and I say this one track I need to not link the EQ, then I can just pull the EQ down to insert B and it won't be linked anymore, and I just start from B down. So I am in the habit of creating groups in a way where I have options, and if I want a particular link, then I'll use the first 1 or 2 inserts, and if not, I'll start with C and work the way down from there. And sends are the same way. So I link 1 insert control, 1 send control, click OK, and I'll just switch over to the mix window for this. And over in the mix window, I'm just going to say Shift-Alt on Windows or Shift-Option on a Mac, and I'm just going to pull up my Melda EQ here. And I'm just going to shift-click on another plugin window to open 2 of these simultaneously, just so you can see what happens here, that they're both linked this way, okay? So that's the value of linking inserts, particularly with layers where you really are kind of processing them all similarly. Now you can actually see with the strings group, one of the things that I did is on purpose started all of my EQs on B because I had a really particular EQ that I wanted to do on each track individually, even though a couple of those look like they're about the same. So no, those two are still a little bit different. So I just had a couple really particular ideas that I wanted to do with each of those tracks, and so I just started on B. And that's why you can see inserts on kind of different levels that way. I did the same thing over here for the horns, pulled those down to B and said I need to be more particular here. But I have the option to begin with a link that actually helps me get going faster. So what I'm saying is I would still rather link these because the EQ starts here, and I'll start with a high pass filter, and then I'll say, oh, there's a little too much of this. Maybe I'll bump that out. Maybe I have a little bit of a shelf in here somewhere. Maybe I have a little bit of a low pass filter just at the very top end. Now, I'm not staying here on all three tracks, but by doing it in one plugin, I started all three of them here, right? And then I can pull this one down and I can say, you know what? For this one, I want to be a little bit more, take out a little bit more here. And for this one, I need a little bit more brightness out of that patch. And for this one, I need something else. You know, maybe for this one, I need a little bit more low end or whatever that turns out to be. But starting with all of them linked made that whole process faster instead of me adjusting 10 new parameters, you know, with Q and gain and all that kind of stuff. All right, so that's how I tend to work with things grouped before I actually get into the EQing as I move forward there. So that's the value of linking inserts, and sends are the same way, right? The one thing I'll say about sends is that inserts are identically linked, okay? If you, and I just took them off, but if I have a high pass filter and I turn the group off and I adjust one of them and then I turn the group back on, they don't stay relative between the two tracks. They automatically snap all of them when I make an adjustment to one again. Whereas a send level is different. So send levels actually are relative. So, and we can see that actually happening here. So, well, actually, I don't remember if these are linked in this group or not. They probably are, and you can see that. But you can see how they all are set to a slightly different level. We want a little bit less reverb on this viola print track right here. And so they're each just getting something a little bit different, right? So send levels can be relatively maintained in a group. The same thing with faders, just like faders are. But inserts are identically linked. And so just be aware of that. The other thing too is that I'll just option drag or alt drag copies of these up here to show you this. Two different EQs, right? So even though the link is on the track, adjusting one doesn't adjust the other because the plugins are different and they don't agree, you know. So that's just a little bit more detail there about insert and send linking, where it's valuable for you. But those are really powerful things to be able to do, and there are places for those things, you know. I like with the drums, for example, through a number of these tracks. So for my toms right here, I have a transient master plugin. This is a Native Instruments plugin. Very slight emphasis on the attack here. A little bit tighter, a little bit more aggressive on the attack for these three tracks. These are all linked on the toms, just like this, right? So, and that undo isn't working for some reason for that plugin. That's okay. These are not maybe enabled. All right, so that's a plugin that I inserted after I took a preference off. I'm gonna have to talk about that preference now, aren't I? So under the preferences, by the way, in the mixing tab, we have a preference in here for plugin controls default to auto-enabled. You can see that's checked for me right now. At one stage when I inserted these plugins, that was off. But the thing to gain from that being on is that when a plugin parameter is automatically enabled, it automatically has a automation lane as well that is assigned to it. So I'm just going to go to one of these and just show that here is the dynamic EQ. All right, and here are the all the parameters for that EQ, because you can add and take away bands, and you can do a number of different things there. It's a dynamic EQs, there's compressor settings and stuff with that. But all those automation lanes there for that plugin, right? But if I go to one of these tom tracks in here and I click here, you can see the transient master is not in there because when I was inserting those plugins, that preference was off. So the value of having that preference on is that because there is an automation lane for everything that's enabled, any adjustment that you make to a parameter is undoable. So if I make an adjustment to this plugin, it'll probably let me do it. If I do that and undo, is that one not enabled either? So I'm just asking, I'm getting myself into trouble here, aren't I? Expander, is anything in here linked? There we go. So I'll undo that one just to show you there's an automation lane for that, so I can undo it. But for this one, these are not enabled yet, and so there is no undo because there's no automation lane. And an automation lane means there's an edit. So anything you do to a plugin control is automatically an edit also that you can undo. Did that make sense? I'm going to move on. Okay. Just explaining what happened there. All right, so just an example of, with the toms, they all have the same insert A happening there with a little bit faster attack, tighter attack on those. But all the EQs are different because they're toms, and they all should be different. Whereas the expander is probably the same for all of them. I do have a couple slight adjustments there. But I probably, at that stage, just did an alt drag to all of these and then just did a slight adjustment to, to those four from there. So, all right. So let's move on here and talk about a couple other things that just happened when we created this violins group. We have a ID letter, okay, assigned to the group. So how do we utilize that? Well, in the mix window, it's really easy to utilize it because in the mix window, we have an A to Z button right here. And that means that in this window, there is no editing to do. The only thing that there is to do is to navigate around and click on parameters and to move them. And so what can your A to Z keys be used for if you're in this window? Well, they can be used for turning your groups on and off. So V will turn the violin group off. And you can see me pushing that and see what's happening there. The violin group is down here somewhere, is right here, right? So V, and I'm going to turn the, actually it's kind of a neat indicator here. I have a small s for the strings, becomes a large S if there's an underlying group that's also enabled there. No one's actually going to see that in real time or pay attention to that. But if I take the larger strings group off, we can see the smaller group underneath. And you can see violins coming on and off. This is a good time to talk about color briefly because this is not a very obvious color to use as an indicator for grouping. And so I'm going to use a quick key of my own for opening the color palette. And I'm going to click on this little color icon for the group right there. And it automatically chooses the color in the color palette. It's like the most blah color there is available in this thing. And we're just going to change that to the brightest red just to make that a little bit more obvious and to make that pop, right? So we can color code groups in this way. Right now, I'm only color coding the group indicator. I'm not color coding the track that way. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. So I'll just leave this up here for a minute. But while we're talking about using V to turn the group on or off, in the mix window, you can always use your keys for that. Now, the trick to this is really to keep most of your groups within the first A to Z list, one A to Z. And as you can see in my group IDs, I'm using 4 in here. So 4, 2, 3. So you can see, this might give you some indication of how many groups I have in the other project. I don't actually have 100 and whatever groups. I'm not actually using that many. But I do use other hierarchical numbers as I'm working through the same group of tracks in some cases, and where I have layers of groups underneath. And so that's where the 2, the 3, the 4 kind of come in for me when I'm doing that kind of work. Now here's the trick, right? If I go over to the edit window And here is the violins group. This A to Z button is not enabled, right? It's not lit up. This one up here at the top right of the edit window is. And we actually have a couple of these buttons. We have 3 of them, right? So the top right-hand corner of the edit window is your first keyboard focus mode called command focus. So this means my A to Z keys are being used for edits. And so let's see what I'm going to do here. And whoops, wrong button there. For some reason, I'm just looking at my grid. My grid is not even set to bars and beats, which is kind of strange, but I'm over it. I'm good. So let's say I want to go in here and make an edit of some kind, right? Well, I have the group on right now. And so here is the scenario. The scenario is I want to edit off the front space of this violin track right here. But right now everything is grouped, right? So I need to turn the group off. Well, right now my A to Z button is assigned to the actual edits, right? So what I want to do in a minute is press A. I just don't want that to cut all 3 tracks. I only want it to cut off, right, the top one. So we'll undo that by pressing Z. And so if I click on this button now, I can click V, and now I have the opposite problem, right? Now the tracks aren't grouped anymore, but if I press A, that would be assigned to whatever group has the ID letter A assigned to it, which is none of them right now. So A is doing nothing. So now I have to go back over here and click here and press A. So I think doing group focus in the edit window is kind of slow. It's kind of a slower way to do things. What I like to do is use a quick key for suspending all groups while I make an edit, because it's the same key over and over and over, and it allows me to work with an individual track at any point that I want to very quickly, and then turn the available groups back on. So suspending a group means that you are currently bypassing all groups. Like all groups are going to actually be grayed out if I do this. So my quick key for suspending groups, I'm going to show you the list here. Suspend all groups is Control-Shift-G. Now I assigned a different quick key for this because this is a 3-letter key and I want another one to do that a little bit faster for me, okay? So I just used my quick key, which is Start S. And now I can just press A because I'm still in command focus. Now, meanwhile, all of the groups have been suspended, right? For me to make that edit, but I just do my quick key again and turn them all back on again. And so all the groups that I want to be on are on. And the violins could be part of that as well. So another way to look at that, right, let's just undo the edit, would be I'm in command focus. So with the group enabled, I just do Start S, and I click here and press A and Start S again, and the group is back on. So it's faster to suspend all of the groups to make an edit than it is to use an ID letter to turn a group on or off in the edit window. And you say, well, what if you want the group to stay off? Well, if you want a group to stay off, then just go over here and click it and turn it off, and it's just going to be off for a while, right? But you're not going back and forth, and that's not doing anything confusing for you. You're still staying 99% of the time in keyboard focus mode of command focus specifically in your edit window, okay? So you utilize really the ID letter specifically for the mix window. You try to maintain more of the command focus behavior in the edit window, but you have those 2 options. And by the way, you also have this A to Z button over here with the clip list, which if now that I'm there, I can type in a search field, VIO, and it automatically jumps to the viola clip that it sees, the first clip that it sees, right, in the list with those characters. So that's a look at how it applies here. And the quick key to switch between the keyboard focus modes here is going to be on Windows Control-Alt-1 for command focus, 2 for clip list focus, 3 for group list focus. And so if you, on a Mac, it's easier because on a Mac, you can hold down Option and Command with your thumb and go Command Option 1, 2, 3. It's faster to cycle through that way. So if you're on a Mac, get in the habit of doing that. If you're on Windows, never use that. It's just a pain. So They both have their advantages in keys. It just depends on which keys you're trying to use, right? Okay, so let's move on here. ID, letter, color. Let's just come back to color and talk about that for a moment, because here we start to get into a couple of preferences that I can show you. In our Pro Tools preferences, there is a display preference where we can have all of our track colors, the actual strip colors, follow groups. Okay, now this means that you are automatically going to get a color for each group that you have created, and the track color is going to take on that behavior when the group is active. There's going to be a color assigned to an active group. This is a deeper level of visual indication of when a group is actually on or not, okay? So we saw with our violin tracks over here, if I press V, remember I'm just in the mix window, all I have to do is press V to turn that on. This is a pretty good indicator. In the edit window, I don't have that indicator, which might be kind of useful for me. So if I want a visual indicator in both windows, then there's probably a better way to try to utilize that. And this is where track color coding according to groups comes in. Now, the first thing that I need to do, I have a color assigned to all of my string tracks automatically, right? So the first thing I need to do is select these 3 tracks, go into the color palette and say, I want you to follow the color display preference default. So I have a preference set for group color coding, and I need to default my track colors back from my customized color that I assigned to what the preference is set to. So we click default, and now it has arbitrarily assigned red to these tracks, not arbitrarily because I automatically assigned red earlier, right? But now it's the entire channel strip color. So how does this manifest itself? Well, if I press V now, there is no color. The group is off. So this is a much more powerful visual indicator for whether the group is active or not. I don't like this too much because if I have a whole bunch of groups that are off, then the whole, desaturation look in Pro Tools just kind of drives me crazy. So I don't like that too much. I think it plays with my eyes a little bit too much, but it's a very useful indicator, and I could see a lot of people working this way, right? It's really obvious if the group is on or not. I have a deeper level of group color coding happening in here with the drums. I've already kind of done this before we got into this demonstration. So I'll just show you what this can look like for you and how much this can actually help, right? Even in the edit window, if I'm here, I have several groups for drums, right? There's a global group, then I have a group for the toms, a group for a couple snares, a group for kicks. So if I turn the overall drums group off, now I can see, it's a very quick indicator for me, right? That I have a toms group that's active, and a kicks group that's active, and a snares group that's active. And if I turn the snares group off, right? Now the snares are kind of grayed out, desaturated, and now I can see the kicks and the toms really easily. So in this way, I think the color coding is actually really helpful is when you have overlapping groups. And it's helpful for me to understand all I have to do is just, if I'm navigating around through the session, all I have to do is just navigate down here. And I know right away the global group for the drums is off, and only these 2 are on. Now, there's still a value in having the drums group created even though it's off, okay? And so that's what I want to talk about next. I want to get into VCAs and how VCAs with the groups, if we start overlapping some of this behavior, how we can really get another level of organization happening. So a VCA track is assigned to a group. You create a VCA very simply just by going down to VCA master, and you can create a VCA master into the session, okay? So here is a VCA that I have created in the session. I don't need my color palette right now. So we assign VCAs to groups here, right? They're not output controls. There is no audio processing on this track at all. This is by default traditional behavior of how a VCA fader would work on an analog console, where it literally a voltage control of electrical voltage on an analog console. So it's a analog term in a digital platform, which is a little bit strange, but that's where the VCA comes from. And so what's interesting about this is here is the group, right? If I turn the group back on, we can see what the group is. It's all of this color. And the VCA has been assigned to this group. Now, what a VCA does is it assumes mix behavior linking. So when you create this track and you assign it, you automatically have fader link master control here now on this fader. And what that does is it frees your other faders up. Oh, okay. To have individual control. Now, I actually have a preference to show you here about this as well. It's the whole point we're doing this anyway. So I'm going to go into the Preferences window and the Mixing tab. And there is a checkbox here for standard VCA logic for group attributes. That's off right now. And I'm going to turn that on. And by default, it is on. And so I just wanted to make sure I triggered myself to have to show you this. And so I set myself a little trap for myself, and I just fell into it. And I remembered to show this to you, which is now I have global control and individual control at the fader. Okay, but you can turn that off as well and have global control, everywhere. But here's what happens, right? The whole point of the VCA that actually makes this cool is that I can have this group off, and the VCA still maintains global mix control because it's still there and it's still assigned. So you can create groups that you don't even leave on just for mix purposes, so that you have global mix attribute control happening from a VCA and still have individual track fader control here, right? The toms group is still on, so those are still going to move linked. My snares are still going to move linked, right? But global control for all of them is here. And if I wanted to, I could assign a VCA just for the toms. I don't think that's necessary here. But so you can over-organize too, right? I think that's worth pointing out. If you have a VCA on every single group in your session, you're probably over-organizing. There are probably better ways to do that. Unless you only have 3 groups, then you're probably doing great. So that's a way the VCAs work for us, okay? Now, what else VCAs do for us is they give us a kind of trim behavior, a master trim behavior for our tracks, all right? So what I'm going to do is, let's see, we're not really even listening to anything here. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a scenario here. I'll just turn this group back on. We're going to do a scenario here where we're fading the drums in right here, right? Who knows? So I'm just going to open this VCA fader on screen here. And we are seeing automatically volume level here. I'm going to switch all of these tracks to showing volume level as well, so that we can see what the VCA is doing to all of them. And I'm just going to pull this all the way down, and I'm just going to put this track into an automation mode, and I'm going to press play. You can hear it coming out of my headphones probably. All right. Okay. Most excellent fade in the history of music right there. And take a couple breakpoints out of there. So we just did a fade in, right? Now we can see underneath, we actually have a visual indicator for what the VCA did because of a view setting in here. Where is this? Automation. We are looking at a composite playlist of the actual volume position on the track and what the overriding VCA is doing in the background. Okay, that's called a composite view that we are seeing there. Now, the way the VCA behavior works is, okay, what if now I'm going through the session and I'm mixing and I'm saying, okay, my drums need to come up a little louder. Now, what do? Well, I already have automation to the VCA, so do I have to redo the fade in and end up in another place? Do I have to go in here and make another breakpoint and try to do like this kind of business where I'm like, it needs to be actually up here? So what you can do is we're going to reset the VCA, and Avid has this word in here, coalesce. This is like the sexiest word in Pro Tools. right? We're not just merging the automation into the source tracks, which is what this means. We are coalescing the automation. And so we're going to coalesce the automation in here. And that just means we have basically merged it into the source volume playlists. And now the VCA is reset. And that makes the VCA a trim fader now. So now I have automation in the source tracks, but all I have to do now is just take the VCA up a dB or 2 and turn the drums up. And all the way down is still all the way down. So you can see it's kind of recreated this gradual curve to end up at a higher value for each track, okay? And we're listening to the drums and we say, okay, that mix, that level sounds really good. Let's go ahead and lock that in. So I'll right click here and coalesce that out again. And now if we have to make another adjustment at some point down the line, we'll just do another VCA bump of automation and then we'll coalesce that in and so on. So it's a way for you to build out mixes as a trim behavior, okay? Speaking of trim behavior with the way VCAs work, I actually think, yeah, so I have a track here in, now this is the higher version of Pro Tools. And so not everyone may have trim automation behavior available in your version of Pro Tools. You would see it in the automation list. You would see trim down here. So to give you an idea here, if I switch over, we can see that in this track, I had some breakpoints in here where I was doing a couple bumps of the horns in this project. And I felt like that needed to come down a little bit overall. So I wanted to keep those bumps in there, but the overall level of the horns needed to come down after I did that, right? And so let me explain how this layout is working for me. I have VCA automation controlling the horn tracks and how I want them to rise up through a certain part and then and then come back down and have a little bump here. And at some stage, I added some dynamics to the horn, maybe to control it just a little bit more to prevent some peaks just at the top end to round it off a little bit if it was a little too aggressive. And so when I am at this stage in the mix, I don't want to go back and readjust the VCA because the VCA is feeding the compressor, and that is pre-dynamics. And my threshold and everything on the compressor is set to what that is going in. And I don't want to, if I change the automation, I have to readjust the compressor. So at that stage, I am automating the subgroup fader instead. And so I automated the subgroup, and then I realized it's still too hot. The overall thing needs to come down. And so with trim mode, I can keep it in read, but enable trim and pull this down a couple dB. And the overall level of the horns, right, will come down and maintain the shape of that automation. That's what trim does for us. So that's what trim means. It's basically maintaining a shape of automation and taking the whole shape up or down. And we can use tools for that as well. We could just as easily go into here and use the trim tool to do that to all of these. But that gets us into editing, and sometimes that's a little less comfortable, right? Let me show you what you can do with a VCA, though, by the way, if you don't have, right, Pro Tools Spectacular version, whatever it's going to be named next. What you can do here is you can create a group of one track, and I'm just going to do it as an example, right? This is my sub bass only group, and I'm just going to turn follow globals off, and so I'm only doing this for volume control for the VCA, so I'm just going to leave volume checked. This would probably be a secondary group somewhere, and I don't even know what I would do. Let's just go with 2B, because I don't generally do this, but I'm just showing you that it's possible if you don't have trim automation in Pro Tools, is that you can create a VCA in here. And you can assign this to one track, okay? And now you have your automation doing its thing. That's brilliant, by the way. And then you basically have your trim control here on that base, right, to make a slight adjustment to that track, and now you have trim control, even though it's for a single track. So you can create a group of an individual track. It doesn't have to be a whole list. And many of you would probably find that useful because most people do not have Pro Tools Spectacular, right? And so you have Pro Tools Awesome, if that's, let's say awesome is a shade less than spectacular. So that's the whole idea. Whole idea is being able to incorporate these things in where they benefit us, regardless of what the traditional historical use of those things is, right? Cool. Okay, so that's a wrap up of VCAs in there. We go back to our groups list over here. Let's just talk about this other margin over here at the left. This margin over here at the left has to do with track selection. So if I click right here at the left of the drums group, all of these tracks are selected. And this is valuable, especially in the mix window, right? There's a reason I'm in the mix window for this, and it's because in the edit window, because of some other features that we have in the edit window, it's easy enough to just click in a track here, and all of the tracks are selected. One, because the group is on, and two, because of this button right here, which is called Link Track and Edit Selection. I don't have my tooltips on. So this is link track and edit selection. That means that whatever you do in the edit, it selects the track. If you select the track, it moves the selection. So there's a link here between those two things, right? So in the edit window, it's easy enough to just do this and then Shift-Alt-click on an output and assign all of these tracks to the same thing. Assign a plugin to them all the same. Assign a send to them all the same by using Shift and Alt together or Shift and Option together. And so in the mix window, you don't have that. So if you're trying to make an assignment over here, it's actually, you could click here and then Shift click here. It depends on how easy the grouping is that you're working with on screen, or you could just click here and you've done the same thing. So this is track selection in this margin over here. And now you can make an adjustment, you can make an edit to something, an assignment, a little bit faster maybe with the track selected. This is also a cool troubleshooting thing, by the way. I'm just gonna give you an example, okay? Let's see, I'm gonna create a problem for myself where I have these three tracks selected and then I'm off screen and I had a VCA selected, right, by accident, who knows? So I'm just gonna update my violins group as if that was the thing that I did, and I'm gonna click OK. All right, so you can imagine the problem I would have if I was down here mixing my violins and trying to set where I want these to be in the mix, get that balance just right. And actually, I want to crank these up to right about there. And then I'm moving through the session and I'm trying some other things. Now, meanwhile, I just cranked up my drum VCA. And we're not seeing the result of that too much yet. Which one did I do? Was it the VCA? So, but I linked, right, the VCA as part of that group. And so that's the danger of having something off screen when you make a group that you're just not aware of. But at certain stages, you're like, why are my drums so off? Like, why are they just pounding through the ceiling right now? And why is this down? Why is this up? And you just keep going back and forth, scratching your head for an hour before you come over here and you say, show me, you know, what tracks are in this group. And I just click here to select those tracks. And did I not update that? Oh, I didn't use replace when I did that. That's why that wasn't working. So let's do it right this time. Modify, replace, okay? So I'm updating the group, but if I had created it that way initially, I wouldn't even know that. I wouldn't see a tracks list. And we'll click OK. So again, if I do this, we'll actually see the result of that, right? If I press play. And my VCA, so I'm not sure if my VCA even understands quite what's going on. So if I go, the VCA is ignoring that. Interesting. Okay, do I have, what's linked in my violins? It's actually, this is actually really clever. I've never actually done this before where I accidentally linked a VCA. I was trying to do it to show you something cool, and it backfired on me because Avid is obviously protecting VCA linking, I think, in the background here, because volume on the violins is active, and it is automatically not readjusting and not following what I'm doing on the other tracks, which is kind of interesting. So if I pull this down, it's leaving these alone as well. So that's probably a safeguard, and I've never seen that before, but that's actually pretty cool. So let me reset my problem, and I'll just do it with another track in here somewhere. And modify that. Okay, so that's the behavior I was looking for. I just happened to pick the only track type that that's not going to be affected by for good measure. There you go. We both learned something today. Okay, so that's track selection. Let me point out something about the all group, actually, while we're in here. The all group is in every session. It's something you can't take away, but you can compromise it and prevent it from hurting you in any way, which is actually useful for me. So a lot of times I do this in sessions. I haven't really talked about this before, but what the all group does, right, is it automatically links everything. In the edit window, in the mix window, actually everything is enabled. And so these are different groups and everything is moving. That's what the all group does. And it's a surefire way to screw up whatever it is you planned and intended on having going on, right? Well, you can right click and modify the all group. And what I'll do is I'll go in here and I'll say it's mix only. And then I'm just going to uncheck everything that it could possibly link, right? And there is no globals. The all group following globals is kind of interesting. But there are no attributes here. So it's a mix only group and nothing is linked. So actually the all group does nothing in this current state, right? Everything in the session is not moving. There is no edit for everything. And so the all group is essentially nothing. It could be on or it could be off at any time. And that's a way to use the all group kind of to protect yourself as a safeguard against the all group if you think you might accidentally click on it and turn it on. So I think that's what's valuable for me. And just sharing that with you guys as well. But that is an editable group, but it is also hopefully very seldom used, okay? Okay, now we'll take a couple minutes here and just talk about clip groups in Pro Tools and start to kind of layer up some of these features, right? So I have a group created, but in the edit window, maybe I still want to be able to do individual fader controls and mix controls and stuff here, but maybe I want to be able to edit things a little bit different over here. And so I want the editing behavior to be off, but I still want to make working with a couple of groups together maybe easier. So I'm just layering that. I'm just spitballing this right now because I didn't plan this out, but I'm just using this as an example. I'm going to take my kicks and snares and with these audio tracks, right, I'm going to create a clip group. So a clip group is under the clip menu. It is going to be Control-Alt-G by default on Windows. It's going to be Command-Option-G by default on Mac. And I have my own quick key, which is Start Y. And I'll explain that to you in another video as well, because that probably doesn't make sense right away. But Start U, by the way, is to ungroup for me. Start Y is to group. And so it's just an easier, kind of faster key to use anyway. So I'm going to group these four. So I have two track groups in here, but I am edit linking two separate groups by using a clip group, which is not the same thing, right? But what it means is I can click and drag in here, and I could say, I like this kind of roll that I did right here with my kicks and snares. And I want to copy that, and I want to jump that in down here, right? And I can make that edit because of the clip behavior and that is separate from the track grouping behavior. So clip groups will automatically group any clips between tracks or on the same track. So if I come down here to a track where we have multiple clips, right? So I'm gonna do my suspend thing again. So we're gonna suspend our groups, and I'm gonna triple click on a track to select all clips on that track. In this case, there's only 2. But a reason for this would be if I want to apply a clip gain to both of these together, it would just be easier if they were both one clip to do clip gain to, right? So I'm going to group these as a single clip and then use clip gain to adjust them both. And it's technically not adjusting them both, it's technically adjusting one thing, right? But that's where the clip grouping can come in handy on the same track. And and then I just showed you an example of overlapping clip groups and track groups together. There's a whole lot of ways to use clip groups in here. I don't think in this example it would make sense for me to use a clip group on all of the drums, because it'd just be easy enough for me to keep the group on in the first place if they weren't suspended, and to make an edit that way. But that just gives you an example of some of the things you can do with clips as well. Okay, so I think that's the majority of my list. We talked through, let's see, our display preferences. We talked through our mixing preferences with the VCA and all. We got clip groups in there. We talked about keyboard focus, and I think we're in pretty good shape there overall. So I hope that helps give you a couple ideas about ways that you can organize your sessions. Again, I think the more that we utilize these things up front, the better they're going to work for us. By the way, I'll just say this. I don't even have any instruments actually in here. For example, I recorded all of these violins and layers and stuff from instrument tracks. I like creating groups for instrument tracks because it actually helps to use VCAs with groups of string tracks that are broken out, right? So if you have violin, viola, cellos, basses, having a VCA that's actually mapped to the instrument tracks helps you to do some of those volume rides. It's not the same thing as expression, because some instruments are going to actually give you EQ bumps and things like that with an expression adjustment. So in Contact, expression might be a layer of multiple parameters doing something like that. But in the way that it helps you kind of help the strings move a little bit, they all have their different levels and things, but you can VCA control them all to move in and out, where you have much higher fader resolution than you would have as a MIDI message, right? MIDI volume messages are 128 values. Volume automation messages as data are, 24-bit audio is over 16 million. And so you have a lot more resolution at the track fader than you would at the MIDI message fader for volume. So just throwing that out there as well. So I use VCAs and instrument layering and stuff a lot as well before things are even printed for a final mix down. So I hope that was valuable to you. Some really cool things in there, and we're always constantly trying to figure out the best way to utilize these features, right? So have some fun, go create something. Thanks for watching.